Hello. Maybe we'll try to find our seats, those in the back. Hi. So, okay, those in the back, if you can find a seat, there are more seats in the front here. And we shall start very soon. So, find your seat. We have an online audience that is 4 times larger than those registered to be in person, so we should start sharp. So welcome everyone. As I said, we have a good audience, about 4 times, and those of you have quick in calculation, you may have estimated that we have about 200 people registered for this seminar, most of them digitally, and welcome everyone to an exciting seminar, an exciting topic, and an exciting set of speakers. My name is Arild Angelsen. I'm professor at NMBU, the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. So just the seminar topic, art, the architecture for red transactions and their critique from indigenous peoples of tropical forest carbon credits, and using art as an example of a more broader debate that has been going on for quite some time. The organizers, Development Today, and I just quoted their presentation on the website, represented by Anne Usher, and also Bjørn is here, who's the editor, and NMBU, my university, second oldest and most beautiful campus in Norway, about 8,000 students. The old agriculture university is still a strong focus on that. And we have financial support from Fritt Ord, who I had a trouble translating, but it's free word or free speech, but a foundation that promotes freedom of expression, public debate, and culture. So that is what we'll do. We have a lot of nice debates ahead for the next 3.5 hours, I hope. Quickly on the program. We'll do a small background introduction, so we are on the same kind of ideas on what we are to talk about to set the scene here. I'll do a few things, and Anne will take over. And then some of the indigenous critique by Levi Sucre, who is from Costa Rica, and Mauro Hastings from Guyana, and Julia, sitting in Mexico on holiday, but normally based in Oslo at the Rainforest Foundation, has been coordinating a letter that many of you may know of that was sent to Art earlier. Then after the coffee break, Andreas Dahl Jørgensen, just back from a semi-long stay in Brazil, and back to being the head of the NICFI, the Norwegian International Climate Forest Initiative, back on Monday, I think. Christina Vogt, who is a professor of law, and also has been involved in RED negotiations for quite a while, and also currently a member of the Art Board. And Dara Conway is here with us from the 10-year facility in Stockholm. And after that, we have a small panel discussion. So, just RED, what is it? The basic logic of RED that has been around since, let's say, 2007, the Bali COP, when also Norway launched its NICFI initiative, is as follows. Climate change is real. We are committed to the Paris targets, to preferably 1.5 degrees. And we cannot reach those targets without protecting tropical forests. They may be up to 1/3 of the climate solution. Tropical forest and nature-based solutions. And we cannot protect those forests without proper incentives. And incentives is conditional payment. You are rewarded for doing something. That's an incentive in the form of result-based payments. Now, in order to have result-based payment, we need a sound system for verifying or certifying emission reductions. Verifying, referring to voluntary markets, and certifying to compliance. my rule of thumb is V, verifying, voluntary, C, certifying, compliance. So your rule of thumb if you want to remember something. So we need a good system for that, and we need also to mobilize the funding to pay for it. Can be development aid, as it has to a large extent been so far, or it can be private from carbon markets, doing various types of offsetting. And I often distinguish between offsetting. It can be a moral offsetting. If I fly, I normally offset it and buy carbon credits. It can be political. Some have argued that that is what Norway is doing to offset the fact that we are, after all, one of the main oil exporting countries in the world. Or it can be regulatory, where you have mandated, you have a cap, and you have to meet that cap either by cutting your own emissions or by buying credits. Now let me say that I'm not against offsetting. I don't think it's morally wrong to offset, and we do it, and we should do it. The problem is when it can become an excuse and a sleeping pad for doing less to cut your own emissions. For all of that, we got art trees, and leaf. And maybe in this, the ingredients in the acronym SOUP, just a few things. Red, we know more or less what it is, but I've been confused about what red is, so therefore when we worked on some of the books with CIFAR, we came up with what we thought is a useful definition. And remember, a definition is a definition. It's not right or wrong. It's useful to various degrees. So we defined it as being characterized by two things. One, it's the conservation of tropical forest and emission reduction as a main goal, and there is some type of performance-based or result-based incentives involved. So you sometimes use the term unconditional incentives, which I think is a contradiction. So you are rewarded based on performance, for example, in terms of emission reductions. Art, the architecture for red transactions, came in 2018. It's a verifier of these carbon credits for jurisdictional red programs. Trees, the red environmental excellence standard, that's the acronym, is kind of the standard. And the current version, 2.0, is 4 years old, and it's under revision. So we are talking about art or trees, or even art trees credits. I see this being used interchangeably, but it is the same thing. But art as the kind of the overall architecture, and trees as the standard. Then we have LEAF, the lowering emission by accelerating forest finance. These are a mouthful, some of them. Founded in 2021, a coalition of 4 countries, 3 initially, now also joined by South Korea, and some 30 corporations that can buy art credits. But also say that art credits are not the only buyer. They may be bought by, say, Corsia, the aviation, or they may sell to any other country, as we'll see an example for Guyana. And then you have Emergent as a broker and transaction platform between the countries and the private sector. So my simple slide that I used for how to create a market, you need a commodity, that is the art trees credits. You need the buyers, and they are represented by the LEAF coalition. You need the seller, that's the tropical jurisdictions at the subnational or national level. And you need a broker or a marketplace, which is Emergent. So just a quick background on why my reading, and maybe Andreas or others will have more to add and take a slightly different angle, but my kind of outsider angle, why did art, trees, and LEAF come about? First, the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations under the UN, the standards are too lax, particularly when it comes to this environmental integrity, additionality, which is essentially setting realistic reference levels, the counterfactuals. So the countries submit their reference levels to the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn. There are obvious incentives to exaggerate, to make them higher, because an emission reduction is the difference between the reference level and the actual emissions. So the larger that difference is, the larger the emission reductions, and the larger the potential payment is. So you don't have these checks and balances, which is very hard if you have a consensus process as the UN. The carbon project critique has been strong, maybe particularly after LEAF and ART was formed 2-3 years ago, Guardian articles, you all know that, and the critique that there is no additionality, these are fake credits. Some of that is correct, but it's also, I think, missing some nuances in the debate, not the topic of this seminar. But it was therefore we should go to a higher scale with jurisdictional approach, subnational or national state, provinces, whatever, is at the subnational level. Because reference level setting is easier, you can invoke policies. And the third point was the failure to create a global carbon market. Early days, for those of you who remember, the idea was to have a cap and trade market where countries take on caps like we did in the Kyoto Protocol. That was only for so-called Annex 1 countries, but that could be enlarged, all countries have caps. And maybe we could use forest carbon credits as a trading within that, like we had for this clean development mechanism, those of you remember. So we could get funding from compliance offsetting. That is idea, I think, is dead. It was more or less killed in Copenhagen, or a few years after. There were some attempts, but eventually it will not turn out. So the COP21 in Paris is a very different ball game. It's nationally determined contribution, submission of what you want to do, but no global carbon market. At least some had a vision of 10, 15 years ago. You still can do it under this Article 6, 6.2 and 6.4, but progress has been relatively slow. So R3 is a response to this, but the road has been bumpy, and one of the things that we'll discuss today is this indigenous critique. Let me just close with a couple of words. One is, I don't know who said this, but I heard the first head of NICFI said it, ministers have said it. We are doing red because it's important, not because it's easy, which has become, I think, a Norwegian folk proverb, more or less. I add that because it's so important to succeed, we need to be extra critical. We cannot afford to do things and have proposals that don't work. So we should be extra critical, not to shut down the idea that there is always a risk if you are too critical, but to make sure that it works for the planet and for the people. So that at least my approach to going into this debate and this seminar. So I welcome you all and wish a good seminar. Before I give the floor to Anne, journalist in Development Today, who will dig more into the details of the critique. So please, Anne.
Let's test the mic. Is that okay, everybody? Hi, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Anne. I'm a journalist with Development Today. I would also like to welcome everybody here in Oslo and to many, many people who are watching from all over the world. So Arild has already helped us through this alphabet soup of acronyms, and it is not simple stuff. I've been trying to dig through it for several years now, and I'm going to try to help you through this material as best I can. I'm going to start by trying to situate us in the Norwegian context a little bit more. The Norwegian International Climate Finance Initiative, short form NICFI, is an enormous undertaking. Though it's managed from the Climate Ministry, it is entirely financed from the aid budget. Since 2008, NICFI has dispersed 45 billion crowns, and the initiative was recently extended to 2030, by which time it will have dispersed 65 billion crowns. So I think it's safe to say that there has never been anything on this scale in Norwegian aid. Starting in around 2018, when it was clear that donors were not going to be putting up aid money for REDD+ on a similar scale as Norway, NICFI shifted strategy to trying to help countries access private finance. They started building up an architecture to facilitate the trade in tropical forest carbon credits between governments in forest countries and large private companies. And Arild has laid out the main components of that architecture. Now, the currency in this trading system between governments and eventually companies like Amazon, Unilever, Bayer, Walmart, GSK, and so on, the central piece in this architecture is a new kind of carbon credit to be managed by a brand new carbon certifier called ART. ART stands for Architecture for REDD+ Transactions, ART. Unlike small carbon projects covering a limited area of forest that have been quite badly criticized over the last couple of years, these credits will be so-called jurisdictional. And that means they will cover entire countries or large provinces within countries. And the idea is that because of the sheer size of these areas, the trading system will rapidly generate billions of dollars in revenue for tropical forest countries, governments, and serve as a powerful incentive to them to then slow deforestation. NICFI's role as a donor and as a driving force behind ART and this architecture really cannot be overstated. Norway was the sole financier of ART for the first 5 years or so. NICFI contributed intellectually to ART's design, provided financing for the setup. Andreas Dahl-Jørgensen, who will be speaking later, the head of NICFI, was a member of the first interim board of ART. The point is that ART is very much a Norwegian aid finance project. As such, Norway also bears special responsibility for what ART does. In fact, part of the impetus for this seminar is that there has been so little critical discussion in Norway about this, from NGOs, from politicians, from mainstream media. Now, Norway has a unique history of funding Indigenous peoples' organizations. And NICFI fully acknowledges the growing body of scientific evidence that shows that Indigenous peoples are the best guardians of tropical forests, where Indigenous peoples live, and especially where their tenure is recognized. Tropical forests tend to thrive. Now, NICFI has consistently claimed that ART has the highest integrity in the market, safeguarding the environment and respecting Indigenous rights. But for years now, even before ART issued its first credit, almost 3 years ago, Indigenous organizations have been arguing that that is not the case, that the ART setup does not guarantee that their rights are respected. So why is this important for us? Because it is estimated that Indigenous communities claim ownership to more than 1/3 of the world's remaining intact tropical forests. The carbon sequestered in these forests exists because of their actions. The carbon in these forests is their carbon. And the point is not that ART ignores that fact. The ARTS standard, which is called TREES, but I try to avoid too many acronyms, ARTS standard recognizes this. It specifies that when a government applies to ART for credits, it must describe how carbon rights will be obtained from Indigenous communities. I'm quoting from the texts. The government must have clear proof of ownership of the carbon before the credits can be issued. Basically, it must demonstrate to ART that communities have ceded their ownership and control over the carbon held in their forests. Now, art doesn't get involved in the nitty-gritty of consultations, negotiations, conflicts between governments and communities. All that is supposed to be sorted out and verified by a consultancy company before art can approve the credits. Currently, 26 jurisdictions have started the process of applying to art for carbon credits. But so far, only one country has crossed the finish line. In December 2022, art issued its very first carbon credits, 33 million tons worth, to Guyana. These were immediately sold on to an American oil company, Hess Oil, for $750 million. In other words, art has only been tested once. In Guyana, Indigenous communities claim ownership to about 30% of the forest estate, though they have legal rights to a smaller part of that territory. When art announced its decision, it declared that the national Indigenous body, the so-called National Tushaus Council, had endorsed the sale of the credits, generated in, quote, both titled and untitled land, both titled and untitled land. Indigenous leaders, including Mario Hastings, who we will hear from soon, a member of the Executive Council of the Executive Committee of the National Tushaus Council at that time, said that communities were not properly consulted and that the government had not obtained rights to sell the carbon. As another Tushaus said to me back in 2022, in effect, the government is selling something that isn't theirs to sell. So, what happens when a government claims to have clear proof of ownership to the carbon, and art takes the government at its word, but Indigenous peoples disagree? What kind of recourse do communities have? Well, art's grievance mechanism was triggered for the first time then, with this first issuance of credits, in 2023, when the Amerindian Peoples Association, a Guyanese Indigenous NGO, of which Mario Hastings is now president, submitted a formal complaint to art. It was dismissed, mainly on technical grounds. The Amerindian Peoples Association then appealed. The appeal was not accepted. It's worth mentioning, though, that according to art's rules, both Trees 1 and Trees 2, the appeals committee must have 3 members, one coming from Winrock International, which is the American organization that hosts art, one member coming from the art board, so a person who had been part of the original decision to approve the credits, and then one external expert. So by any measure it's a rigged setup. We will hear more from Mario Hastings about what went down, his reflections on this. But now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Levi Sucre Romero, a Bribri Indigenous leader from Costa Rica. He is the General Director of the Mesoamerican Alliance for People and Forests, AMPB. He, when he was involved in a lot of these discussions, he was the co-leader of the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities, which many of you know, GATC, which has been a key actor in global climate negotiations. We have invited him to speak because more than a year before art approved the first credits to Guyana, Levi Sucre was already raising questions about how art and the tree standard would function in practice. He warned that art's design carried an inherent risk. That was that governments would sell off Indigenous carbon without their consent and even without their knowledge. He contrasts his own country, Costa Rica, where there has been extensive consultation around forest carbon and REDD+ for over a decade, with a situation in most tropical forest countries where Indigenous communities are much more vulnerable in relation to their governments. During much of 2022, AMPB, the organization that Lévi heads, tried to work with ART to improve the tree standard based on the Costa Rica experience. In total, there were 5 in-person meetings between ART and AMPB, as well as 3 online conversations. By the end of that year, Lévi Sucre said that he believed that the parties had come to an understanding about the need to modify the standard and on a roadmap for doing so. Then in December, the ART board announced that it had issued credits to Guyana. After that, Lévi Sucre said, "We have been telling ART since last year that this mechanism would not work, and now the situation in Guyana proves that." He eventually gave up on the dialogue with ART. We wish, of course, that we could have invited him here in person with a proper translator and so on, but we didn't have the resources for that, to make that happen. But we are very grateful that he has sent a video message to this seminar. It is in Spanish with English subtitles. Here is the presentation of Lévi Sucre Romero of AMPB. Thank you so much.
Un saludo para todos y todas las presentes. Mi nombre es Lévi Sucre Romero, soy indígena Bribri de Costa Rica y director general de la Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosques. Quería referirme al tema del mercado de carbono con relación a los pueblos indígenas. Yo desde 1997 en mi territorio participamos en los programas de mercado de carbono a través de nuestro gobierno en Costa Rica, y desde el 2010 iniciamos una consulta sobre la estrategia de red en el país para construir la estrategia nacional red con la participación de los pueblos indígenas. Yo considero que es uno de los procesos más completos de consulta sobre este tema de red que vincula los mercados de carbono, porque se aplicó el principio del consentimiento previo libre informado, que es una norma internacional para trabajar con los pueblos indígenas. En ese sentido, en los últimos años, el mercado de carbono pues, ha tenido una variación porque se impulsaba primeramente a través de los gobiernos, a través de la estrategia de red, pues lo que se conoce como el mercado regulado, pero hace unos 5 años atrás quizás se ha venido abriendo otro espacio en el mercado de carbono, que son los mercados no regulados o los mercados voluntarios, que más bien es una relación directa entre gobiernos, empresas y pueblos indígenas, y ese auge se ha dado mucho en nuestros países, en Mesoamérica y en varias partes del mundo, con un problema profundo que es que no alcanza lograr su integridad para aplicar en los pueblos indígenas, porque no contiene los principios básicos de consulta, como es el del consentimiento previo, libre e informado. Es así que cuando surge este mercado también surgen las que se llaman las certificadoras de créditos de carbono de alta integridad, y pues llega a nuestros países, y nosotros como Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosques, y yo en el papel de director y con la experiencia de Costa Rica, analizamos lo que se venía dando con las certificaciones para este mercado voluntario, y nos dimos cuenta que no estaban garantizando los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales en sus certificaciones. Es ahí donde hicimos una fuerte incidencia, especialmente analizando los estándares de ART3, y tuvimos varias reuniones y varias denuncias sobre que estas certificaciones no estaban alcanzando cubrir estos derechos, y la limitante principal es que los procesos de consulta no se hacen adecuadamente, y hay mucha desconocimiento, no es tan transparente de cómo funciona la certificación con el comprador o quién compra o quién está dando la plata. Y esto es muy cuidadoso para los pueblos indígenas, ya que puede que las mismas empresas que estén criminalizando a nuestros líderes sean los mismos que a la vez nos quieran comprar créditos de carbono. Entonces, para los pueblos indígenas es bien importante conocer con toda transparencia para quién se certifica, por qué se certifica y al final de cuentas para qué van a usar esos créditos de carbono. Todos estos elementos pues no están contemplados en las certificaciones. Cuando las certificadoras hacen estos análisis o estudios para certificar, no llegan a llegar a alcanzar estos temas. Otro elemento central de la debilidad de estas certificadoras es que no determina si hay un acuerdo de distribución de beneficios en el país que le llegue a los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales que son al fin los que cuidan los bosques. Esto es un elemento central para participar en el mercado de carbono, ya que los estudios recientes han dicho que el financiamiento climático no está llegando a la comunidad. Menos del 1% llega a los territorios donde están los bosques. Y si se sigue la práctica de que las certificadoras no miden o no analizan esta distribución de beneficios si está llegando a los pueblos, pues puede incrementar esta problemática de que la inversión climática no sea efectiva para el fin que se busca, que es proteger los bosques. Ante esta problemática, nosotros como Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosques presentamos una guía cuáles son las acciones que debe tomar una certificadora o cualquier proyecto de mercado de carbono para trabajar con los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales en Mesoamérica, y que también pusimos a disposición de otros pueblos en otras partes del mundo. Esta guía surge después de un diálogo fuerte y profundo con Art3, donde no encontramos el espacio, digamos, para hacer los cambios dentro de su propio programa. Entonces decidimos hacer una guía para dejar plasmado en un documento nuestras demandas y nuestro planteamiento con relación al mercado de carbono. Pues hoy, en 2025 que estamos, es una realidad que el mercado de carbono privado no regulado pues está teniendo mucho más auge que el regulado, y hay muchas empresas llegando a nuestros territorios, muchas certificadoras llegando a nuestros territorios, y todos están careciendo de todo esto que he recapitulado y analizado. Pues lo que hacemos nosotros es seguir tratando de que se cumpla la guía, no solamente a nivel de las agencias que certifican, sino también llevándole esta información a las comunidades para que conozcan cuáles son sus derechos y cuáles son los aspectos que deben tomar en cuenta en un eventual mercado de carbono. Volviendo al tema de ART, pues ellos continuaron con unos diálogos después de esta discusión que se hizo con la MPB, con la guía. Continuaron con unos diálogos a nivel del mundo, creo, con liderazgo sobre este tema. Pues yo lo llamo diálogo porque para mí no califica como una consulta bajo el consentimiento previo, libre e informado. Sin embargo, desconozco los resultados de ese diálogo. No sé si han tenido algún cambio o no en su forma de trabajar. Lo que sí es cierto que en Costa Rica, que ya participa a través de la coalición LEAF y que se certifica a través de ART, todavía tenemos muchas dudas con respecto a cuál es la relación entre la persona que hace las evaluaciones, en este caso, ¿cómo es que se llaman estos? Pues la empresa que contrata ART para hacer las verificaciones, y los mismos estándares de ART y el mismo comprador. Entonces, algo estamos esperando que se nos aclare, no sé si por vía de gobierno, no sé por vía de la coalición LEAF o por vía de ART o por vía de los mismos verificadores de país. Bueno, ¿cómo está esta relación? Porque sentimos que no hay mucha transparencia en esto. Además, los pueblos indígenas en Costa Rica criticamos mucho de que los evaluadores de que hacen estas evaluaciones para las certificadoras, pues imagínate que nos mandaron a alguien que solo habla inglés y no entiende español, y así quería reunirse con nosotros que no hablamos inglés y con costo medio hablamos español. Entonces, hay muchas falencias en este tema de certificación que no son resueltas, que no están resueltas, pues a mi entender, porque no he visto que ha cambiado. Pero bueno, esa es la situación actual. Volviendo al tema de ART y el LIF y la coalición, pues no conozco los alcances de los últimos diálogos que hicieron ellos, en los cuales no participé. Dejo claro, no participé porque creo que eso no es una consulta para mí, pero en fin de cuentas, ya la MPB como institución representativa de los pueblos indígenas, ya dimos nuestro criterio, ya dimos nuestras recomendaciones, ya dimos nuestras propuestas en lo que llamamos la guía de mercado de carbono para pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales.
Shall I go up here? Thank you, Levi. Thank you, Maribel, for your help with that. I will now move on to our next speaker, Mario Hastings. Do we have him coming? There we go. Mario Hastings is an Indigenous leader from Upper Mazaruni District in the west of Guyana. He has served as a Tushao, an Indigenous leader, for 12 years, and he has advocated for Indigenous peoples' land rights for decades. Last year, he was elected president of the Amerindian Peoples Association, an Indigenous NGO, also member of COICA. Again, we wish we could have invited you, Mr. Hastings, to join us in person, but we are grateful to have you online. He is speaking from his home, I believe, in Kako Village in Upper Mazaruni. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. I think you're muted. Mr. Hastings, can you turn on your microphone? No, we still don't have you. Try one more time, please. Hello?
Good morning.
There we go. We hear you. Thank you.
All right. All right. Thank you for giving me this time. Good morning, good afternoon to each and everyone who are in person there and also who are listening to us virtually. Yes, my name is Mario Hastings, and I've already been introduced, and I am happy for this opportunity to let everyone know what has been happening in our country, Guyana, as it is the first country that have been certified by Architecture for Red Plot Transactions. So I would like to speak about the consultation process that happened in our country. Know that you will be aware that the government have been saying that the consultation process in Guyana was good, but we have said this before, and I would like to repeat by saying that the consultation process in Guyana was not good. Many of our communities have stated that they were not properly, if at all, consulted on the sale of carbon credits in Guyana. Many do not fully understand the measuring formula being used by the government through the LCDS program, Low Carbon Development Strategy Program. And communities have been receiving the disbursements from the carbon sale and recognize that this can have positive effects on their development. However, communities are still concerned about the implications of the program regarding their rights to land and self-determination. And I would like to highlight here that when all of this began, the government, in its proposal to ART, would have committed the indigenous forests on their title lands and also on their customary lands without their consent. They were not aware that the forests on these lands would have become part, as we would have heard. And so that is what caused the whole concern us here in Guyana as the indigenous people. So that is why we keep saying that we were not adequately or properly consulted. And there was not much information that would have been disseminated to the people so that they would have made the right decision. And so our communities are concerned about the program having impacts on the rights to land and self-determination, because we feel that as indigenous people, we have that decision or the choice to make with regards to our lands and anything that happens on it, whether it be projects, programs, whatever by the government. And the implications of such agreements will have on our land and territorial rights, since government did not consult with village councils on the carbon market program, and its implications for indigenous governance structure. Also, the 15% allocation to Amerindian villages was not done in consultation with indigenous governance bodies such as district and village councils. I must say that this came about from the government, and we were just told that they have decided to give us 15% from this carbon credit scheme. And that is when most of the Tishaus, they would have agreed. I would say maybe they were not too clear, but at least they were happy to benefit from the proceeds from this carbon scheme. So there have been limited access to information regarding how funds should be used and administered. And so that is how we have participated without much information. And also, people would have complained about the technicality of the documents, languages. I know that at the beginning, you were giving us a background to all of the acronyms, so much acronyms and all the big words. They were very hard, and that would have needed time in order for the people to really understand and to make collective decision on these carbon credits in Guyana. And also, I would like to speak on the legal representative of indigenous people, in this case, the National Coast House Council. Uh, Again, you would have seen that the government would have said that NTC is the only legal representative of indigenous people. And their endorsement of the resolution of one of the National Tourism Conference, which is a yearly conference, would have given that go ahead for the government to get into agreement for this carbon deal. But I would like to say that NTC is not the only legal representative of all indigenous peoples in Guyana. According to the Amerindian Act, the National Tourism Council is an advisory body to the government. The National Tourism Council do not have the power to decide on village matters, nor territorial and resource management issues, which is what carbon market programs are tied to. It must also be noted that it is the village councils that hold title for the village and not the National Tourism Council. So any decision related to lands, those decisions have to be made at what you call a village general meeting, where all the residents would be present, and that majority of the residents would have to agree to whatever would pertain to the lands. In this case, like carbon carbon credit scheme. So it is wrong to say that the National Tourism Council is the only legitimate body to represent the indigenous people. So the NTC's role, the National Tourism Council's role, is to advise the government on national policies based on the consultations and mandates they receive from the various village councils, and by endorsing the carbon credit sale with our proper consultation and consent from village councils. The National Tourism Council oversteps its role in the decision-making process of indigenous peoples. The National Research Council is meant to facilitate this process and advise the government of Guyana on national policies affecting indigenous people based on community level deliberations. All two shows did not endorse the resolution based on limited consultation. A quick turnover and that they did not meet with their village council to decide on their involvement in the program. While the National Tourism Council passed a resolution endorsing the Low Carbon Development Strategy 2030 program, some Tushos and indigenous groups, including the Amerindian Peoples Association, raised concerns about the process and whether it truly reflected the will of the communities, especially on carbon markets. And I must be honest to say that I am still learning. I have a lot to learn still on these carbon markets as I stand here. And after the approval of the credits, Amerindian People's Association would have submitted a complaint and then an appeal. Arts Architecture for Red Transactions reaction to our complaint was not accommodating to our organization's recommendations on how the grievance mechanism should be activated, happen with respect to our decision-making processes as an indigenous peoples organization. The Amerindian People's Association position on arts grievance mechanism remains that it needs to be more independent and responsive to the decision-making processes of indigenous peoples. The Amerindian People's Association has published its position in more detail on its website. In summary, ARD maintained that the government of Guyana was in conformance with the three standards to move ahead with the carbon sale, despite the Armenian People's Association highlighting how it failed to be compliant with these standards. The design of ARD's grievance mechanism falls short of international standards for non-state-based grievance mechanisms. Moreover, trees does not contain detailed information about the mechanism's mandate or objectives, nor the policies and processes for resolving grievances. This model is insufficient in addressing how to respect indigenous people decision-making processes and concerns for such programs, and we hope that with the upcoming R3's 3.0 review process, this can be improved. Additionally, international standards for non-state-based grievance mechanisms, such as ART, state that for such mechanisms to be effective, they must be legitimate, accessible, predictable, equitable, transparent, rights-compatible, and source of continuous learning. These standards form part of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights and have been further elaborated by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Therefore, these needs to be incorporated into trees and arts general operation, given the significant role of indigenous peoples in these programs. And finally, our message to the Norwegian government about how art work and practice in Guyana, the only country where credits have so far been approved. The art system puts indigenous peoples at risk of losing their rights at the cost of financial benefits without proper consultation and consent. The art system relies heavily on the government stating that it complies with the three standard without independent validation of this practice and at domestic and expertise levels. Although there are periods for which stakeholders and right holders can comment on the government's submission to art, it does not take into consideration the time, resources, and technical knowledge required for indigenous communities to learn, adopt, and respond to the carbon market initiatives. The system, therefore, makes indigenous peoples vulnerable to state intervention without proper free, prior, and informed consent, while prioritizing the financial goals of buyers that can subject programs to claims of greenwashing. My message to the Norwegian government is that while communities are interested in ways to financially benefit from the work they have been doing since time immemorial, in sustaining the natural environment, it should not come at the expense of our right to our lands and territories, nor our right to self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent. Therefore, the Norwegian government must ensure that these programs have robust consideration of indigenous peoples' rights to ensure that there are systems in place that prioritize the social integrity of carbon market sales along with their environmental integrity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hastings. We have time for a few questions. Unfortunately, we can't open up to the participants who are online, but we have a good group of people here in Oslo. And if someone has a question, please raise your hand. Andrea, can you put your hand up? She has the, no, yes. Ida, sorry, has the microphone. Excuse me, yes. If you have a question, please let Ida know, and she can hand the mic over to you. Please stand by, Mr. Hastings, so we can... does anybody have a question? Okay, last chance. All right, but I guess your presentation was extremely clear, and I just want to thank you so much for... Wait, okay. Arild, who is a professor at NNBU University, he would like to ask you a question. Go ahead, please, Arild.
So, my question is about when Guyana, when the government signs this agreement, or does it have kind of an implications of land use? To achieve emission reduction, you have to do something that you would not normally do. You have to change your use of forest. So can you say if there has been any discussion of what you should do to change your behavior, and what are the implications on your actual forest use from this agreement or the certification process?
Okay, as I would have mentioned earlier, I did say that we have a lot of questions and concerns that have not been addressed even until now, and those were some of the questions that we were asking the government. What would be the implications? What are the conditions in this agreement? But they have not responded positively. All they would have said that there is nothing that would have any kind of impact, but we just cannot believe they're saying that we haven't even participated in the negotiations. It was just between the government and the other party. And then we were just told that the agreement was signed and then we would receive money. So the impacts that we are fearing would be like prohibiting us from continuing our way of life. But as I said, we haven't received much information on this as indigenous people because we depend on the forest. Would it affect our farming? These are questions that needed to be answered, but were not really given a positive response.
Thank you so much. Do we have another question from the room? Okay, but then with that, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and I hope you will stay on. We would like to welcome you back for the panel discussion a little bit later. Okay. With that, I would like to move on to our next speaker. As part of the process of revising ART's standard, which is called TREES, ART's standard, the Arts Secretariat has engaged with some Indigenous organizations. ART says that they have held 3 regional consultations during 2024 in Peru, in Nepal, and in Cameroon. But ART has refused to make public which organizations were invited and what was discussed in those meetings. Over the same period last year, other Indigenous organizations have called for reform of ART's carbon standard, but ART has refused to meet with them. Our next speaker, Julia Naime, will tell us a little bit more about this. She is Senior Advisor at Rainforest Foundation Norway, where she focuses on international forest finance, carbon markets, and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights in supply chains. Before joining RFN, she was a researcher with CIFOR, Center for International Forest Research. She studied environmental economics at London School of Economics and did a PhD in economics at NMBU, with her research focusing on economic development and deforestation. Julia actually lives in Oslo, but she is joining us today from Mexico. There we go. Welcome, Julia, and please, the floor is yours.
Hi, hi everyone, and a pleasure to be joining you. Although online, as Ariel mentioned, I had to take a late summer vacation this year, so it wasn't possible for me to join physically, although I would have loved to. Thank you, NMBU, and also Development Today for organizing this seminar and inviting us. So I assume most of the audience knows who we are at Rainforest Foundation Norway, but for those who don't, we are a rights-based conservation organization, and related to carbon markets, our position and goal in the work we do in carbon markets is to ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities can drive their own climate and mitigation agenda in REDD+ projects and programs. In that sense, we're not against or for carbon markets, but rather work with IPs and LCs so they can choose for themselves whether they want to participate, how they want to participate, and ensure that carbon markets and the benefits that derive from there are aligned with their self-determined priorities. We also work on jurisdictional REDD+, as opposed to projects, because we believe that jurisdictional REDD+ has the greatest potential to create change by giving incentives to states and governments to improve their institutional structures that lead to deforestation. This includes unclear land tenure, harmful policies and programs, weak enforcement and regulation that allow deforestation to continue, but it will also lead to violation of Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. So we see those two interrelated problems between deforestation and violation of Indigenous peoples' rights. And in that sense, we believe that the jurisdictional programs have to be aligned with ensuring greater protection of Indigenous peoples' rights. We are constantly exposed to scientific evidence showing that protection IP rights, clarifying land tenure is one of the most effective ways to protect rainforest. And it only makes sense that jurisdictional progress also ensure that the rights are properly protected. So our work on jurisdictional REDD has been really driven by partners' demand and the work we have been putting up together with partners. What I will present today is the work we did in preparation to the revision of the tree standard, where we had a workshop with multiple partners to discuss carbon markets, the challenges they're facing. And after that workshop, it was decided that one of the most important priorities we could jointly organize and do some advocacy work was the engagement on the revision of the tree standard. This is recognizing that jurisdictional REDD+ is having an important role in many of the jurisdictions where our partners are based, and the increasing awareness of the challenges of implementing jurisdictional REDD, and in particularly the implementation of the Cancun safeguards and the verification. So we can go to the next slide. I only have this one slide. I will get into the details of the recommendations we covered in the letter, and in the QR code you have access to the letter itself, and you also can see the list of signatories. So as mentioned, before getting into the specific recommendations, I'll go a little bit back into the origins of the letter. I mentioned that we had a workshop with partners in New York Climate Week in last year, in 2024. And after that workshop, we jointly decided to prioritize this, putting together a set of recommendations to the Art Secretariat given that they were we knew we were revising their trees standard this year. The recommendations were based on that discussion, but also on a lot of the partners' work, including the AMPB guidelines that Levi mentioned, including the experience that we have heard from Romario, from Guyana. And after the workshop in New York Climate Week, we set up a working group, a specific working group with 9 partners, where we met repeatedly, either online or physically in the following conferences in the autumn to discuss the specific recommendations of the letter. We sent this letter on December 18th to the Art Secretariat. And it was signed by a total of 14 organizations from Latin America. We have countries, indigenous peoples and local communities representatives from Belize, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Guyana, and Peru. So I do want to highlight that we recognize that ART has made significant efforts to provide guidance on how the Cancun safeguards can be implemented. It has come a long way compared to other standards and initiatives. It is the only standard that has third-party certification on the safeguards, and that provides this specific guidance with different teams on how the safeguards can be implemented. But then we see from the experiences from partners that there is a lot of room for improvement. So into the specific recommendations now that we have in the letter, the letter has 10 recommendations, and they're grouped into 3 main topics. The first topic is the consultation procedure. So Romario has mentioned that one of the main difficulties they had, and a big source of the complaint, was the fact that they were not properly consulted. The process was going too fast. The information was not shared well enough. So the first set of recommendations is really emphasizing the fact that there needs to be early consultation procedures. And by early, we mean as early as the concept note. We are aware that the concept note is not subject to third-party verification. It's a tentative proposal of a jurisdictional REDD+, but because of that reason, it is important to open it up, to share it with different stakeholders, so that the following consultation is as inclusive as possible. Within that set of recommendations, we also asked new requirements to have public consultations by the art participants themselves, which the standard can create expectations, provide some guidance on how, what are the feedback that are received from different stakeholders, and how does the art participant reply to this feedback. And then we also suggested to extend art's own consultation procedures to 60 days. On the consultation, another very important element of the recommendations was that the consultation plans have to be designed inclusively with the participation of indigenous peoples and local representatives. Because otherwise it risks creating some leaving stakeholders out, relevant rights holder out of the discussion. So as early as inclusive the consultation process can start, it will be better for the overall program. And this is something that the standard can create expectations on. On the second set of consultations, it really has to do on program governance in the design and implementation. And here what we really want to emphasize as well is that there has to be a specific governance that ensures adequate and sufficient participation for indigenous peoples and local communities. This involves clearly the adequate participation for the benefit sharing plan, but also the safeguards information system, where indigenous peoples, local communities can decide and can influence what is monitored, how is it monitored, and what are the outcomes that are relevant for themselves according to their self-determined priorities to monitor as being a well-implemented REDD+ program that benefits their communities. The last set of recommendations has to do with improving the certification process itself. We have heard from Romario the problems with the grievance mechanism, from Levi the problems of the validation and verification procedure, where the DVB bodies, the auditors are not well trained with the local context, the local legislation. They may perhaps not speak the local language, and these are requirements that should be incorporated to have a more robust third auditing procedure. There has to be an independent grievance redress mechanism. So Anne mentioned the decisions about which grievances proceed or not are not completely independent, and this is not in accordance with international best practice. And we also expect that to be an evaluation of the status of the national legislation and whether this is in accordance with the protection and the defense of Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. So I can address any further questions on the recommendations with more detail later on. But I can share that we presented this letter to our donors. So we have presented this letter to NICFI and CLUA, for example. We have also presented that with other standards like VERA, who also have a jurisdictional standard. And we have presented this letter to the stakeholder engagement group of the LEAF Coalition. When we drafted the letter, we requested to have a meeting with ART, but it was never granted to us, and this was disappointing given that we came. It's a coordinated effort from a numerous group of diverse organizations in Latin America, and given this effort and the value of the comments coming from partners' experiences, we would have loved to have this opportunity to discuss the positions, the expectations, and also build a common understanding through constructive dialogue on what is expected. And this we have been unable to do it so far. So trees, and this can also be a topic for discussion, but trees 3.0 was recently released. And we do see some significant improvements, like the inclusion of a requirement to have a benefit sharing agreement that has to be negotiated in line with the Cancun safeguards, explicit rights of IPs and LCs to participate in the decisions related to the benefit sharing agreement. So this was not incorporated in the previous version of the standard. But we also think, based on the recommendations we sent in December, there's also room for improvement in this new version of the standard, such as ensuring the early consultation. So a lot to do with the first topic of the letter we sent, and also a lot to do with the incorporating IP and LC decision making in the safeguard information system, as well as strengthening the certification process and the auditing. So I think I can leave it at that and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for that. Clap, yes. Thank you for that. Ida has the microphone. Does anyone have questions? Yes, please. Introduce yourself if you could.
Thank you. Hello, Julia. I'm Claudia Melly McLeod from Future Horizons Institute. I have a question to you regarding the best case scenario that you think we can expect, given your efforts and given the efforts of all these organizations and the response you've had so far. What do you think is the best case scenario in the medium term? Thank you.
the best case scenario is that all our recommendations are incorporated in the trees 3.0 standard. Whether it's realistic, we hope so. So we hope to engage with art and have a continuous discussion to incorporate these expectations into the standard. We do consider that the standard has an important role to play in the supply chain. They set the expectations. They affect. They can lead the way. They can improve. RED+, jurisdictional RED+, can go a long way in improving the governance structures in many of the jurisdictions where we work and where we need to conserve tropical rainforest. And this can only be done through and strengthening the legal and the legal protection of indigenous peoples and local communities' rights.
There's another question at the back, please.
Yeah, I have a question about the third-party verification. What is the main barriers to involve the third-party verification? Thank you.
Yeah. So there is one point that I think it's understandable is that there is, and thank you for bringing up this question, because the VVBs have a very important role to play. They have to be well-informed, well-trained, but the standard also has to be clear and good, so that the VVB can actually know what they're looking for. Right now, there's a lot of flexibility. The VVB can report many things that will give the thumbs up to having complied with the standard, but that does not necessarily meet the expectations of rights holder. So one of the, thinking also about a best case scenario is that there has to be clearer guidance on what is expected for safeguard compliance. And the VVBs then have to be selected and trained so that they can actually verify the standard. But there's a responsibility as well from the standard to provide clear guidance to the VVBs in terms of what is expected, so that they can also verify. And it's it's a new market, right? So there's not a lot of good expertise in the VVBs yet, and therefore the opportunity for improving a lot and to train and to have those high expectations so that we actually have good jurisdictional RED+ programs. So my main point is it's a challenge because there's not a lot of supply of good validation and verification bodies. So it has to be built by providing clearer guidance on what can be expected on safeguards. And also increasing the expectations and the requirements, right? Language, understanding the local context, having expertise on human rights and indigenous people's rights, and so on. So we have to set requirements as strong on the international human rights as we are on the environmental integrity aspect.
Thank you, Julia. I just want to, for people who are listening, VVBs, Julia said it at the end, VVB stands for Validation and Verification Body. These are the external consultant companies that are certified by ART to go in and verify that the applicants have checked off all the rules in the list, and then the decision goes to the ART board. There's one more question. Oh, sorry, the mic is back there.
Sorry, can I just jump ahead of you, Henrik? Sorry. Hello, everyone. My name is Hege Ragnarstveit, and I'm with the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative. Thank you very much, Julia, for your input, and thanks also, I think, to Mario and Levi. I think many of these considerations are, of course, they're really worthwhile to think about and to think about how we can improve the standards. But one of the things that I think we're battling with a little bit here is the time that it takes to, both in terms of language and to make these consultations. I think it took about 8 months in Guyana. And still we hear the critique from Guyana, but it was an 8-month process. So sort of the time it takes to do this in the way you would like to see versus the fact that we are losing rainforests at a much, much higher speed than I think anyone in this room would like to see. So we're sort of racing, what are we racing against, and how can we walk together in a way that we can meet several targets within, and still keep the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. So that's my question is about timing. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you answer, Julia, can we just take the last question, and then if you can address both of them at the same time. We're running a little bit into our break now. Please.
Yes, I'm Henrik Wijk from Oslo New University College. I am also involved in some projects, smaller projects in Peru and Colombia. And my main question is about how do you see the future of the market for art tree? Art tree, the territorial approach, is some kind of a response to the project by project, community by community approach that has failed in many ways and with a lot of scams and so forth. So the confidence in this project market is hardly none. And my interpretation is that from these interviews or the presentation we had from the local people is that they complain about getting too little of the payment, and they don't really trust the government to pass on the payment to them. And as of today, there is hardly any alternative to sell it on their own private project, on their own private market. So they don't complain too much. But in the moment, you actually get higher payment on the private market, which might come through IMO, through ICAO Corsia, through the compliance market. Then you can see a lot higher prices. And then they will start complaining if they're not allowed to sell their own private project because R3, the government, has sold them already. So how do you see this competition between the two different systems?
Those are two quite complex questions, Julia. Please give it a try.
Yeah. And for my answers, I will really focus on what we work, which is really the rights holders' perspective. So on the question of timing, I think here, from a rights holder perspective, this is non-negotiable. If my rights are not being respected, if I don't know, like as Romario is saying, if I don't know exactly what is happening with this program, what does this mean in the future? Am I going to lose my ability to have my shift in agriculture? Am I going to lose my ability to take trees to build my house? I mean, it sounds like small things that in the broader scale also have an impact on the forest, but that also have impact on people's lives. So I think that shouldn't be negotiable, even if it takes time. We have to do it. And the other question on how to address this challenge of timing is that's why we're asking for early consultations. The earliest we engage with stakeholders, the better we will have, the better program we will have the earliest possible. So that's why we're calling, make the concept note public. People are going to start expressing opinions early on. Those can be addressed. They can share expectations. And I think, if I remember correctly, ART now has a limit of 2 years between the concept note and the registration note. So ART itself has a tolerance of 2 years to get the program running. And this should give somehow more time for relevant and important rights holders to participate. But it's a time constraint, there's a resource constraint, consultations are expensive, a lot of actors in the supply chain also don't want to invest a lot in them. But I'm framing it's an investment. It's not paying for the consultations. It's an investment because if you have a good program, it reduces the financial risk, it makes it more effective because IPs have a big responsibility in protecting forests. And it's better for the program itself. The sooner and the better you have those consultations.
Julia, you have just 2 minutes, please. Okay, just 2 minutes because we have to go. Yeah.
On the second question on the future of the market, I cannot predict, but I think national legislations will play a big role. And again, these are only being developed now in many of the countries where we're looking to implement jurisdictional RED a big question is around the nesting questions. So what happens with a project? Countries have to have a registration system for all their projects so that it doesn't overlap with the jurisdictional programs. But so we see some progress in Peru, we see progress in Brazil, but I think this is something that will be very context dependent. And the other element, also bringing it back in terms of the future, I mean, it is important that indigenous peoples have the right to decide how and whether they want to participate in the market. So I think this is also very important to think about when we think about the future of the markets, because there might be an opportunity cost for them in the future if they engage on a jurisdictional versus another market. Either in the jurisdictional program or more project level programs. So this is not something we're working directly, but I think this is something that will be very important for communities to address in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, we're a little bit over schedule, and we were supposed to have a break, Aurel, for 7 more minutes, right? Should we extend it? Yeah. Okay, so the time now in Oslo is 14:24. We'll have a 10-minute break, and please come and sit down at 14:34 so that we can start at 14:35, yeah. So see you in 10 minutes, people who are joining us in India, Indonesia, Brazil, and all points in between. Thank you. Bara i rummet. Ja.
Sorry, the mingling for those that are here is the most important, but we have a schedule. Next speaker, happy to introduce Andreas Dahl Jørgensen, who is head of the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative, NICFI for those that are familiar, established in 2008, if I remember correctly. He was also a member of the first interim board of ART, so of course he's familiar with it. And we have heard about Norway's role as the main funder, and happy that he's back. As I mentioned, just back from Brazil, started again in this job on Monday, so very fresh again for his period after being in Brazil for a few months. So, welcome, and we have a small round of questions after his presentations. So welcome, Andreas.
Thanks, Arild, and thanks for leaving this quote up here that you can't see, but from my predecessor, I believe, who I think stole it from Kennedy and got away with it, or something. I guess the red plus wasn't part of the original quote, but the concept. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for putting this together. I think it's great to have a big group interested in this topic. Important topic, and also thanks to those who are joining us online. I think for us, I think it's important to sort of position this work as part of what NICFI does. I'm going to stick to the topic, but just to say this is one of many strategies that we pursue to help forest countries protect their forests, to reduce emissions, to protect biodiversity, and to strengthen and protect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. From the outset, we kind of thought how to go about when this initiative was born. I wasn't at the very beginning, but I was there. I've been twice at NICFI. In the first period, I was there in quite early days. For Christina, I remember from our days in the climate convention. From the start, we recognized that one important piece of this North-South collaboration, if you will, has to be some kind of an incentive structure to support forests, to reduce deforestation, and support standing forests. It's not the only one, and so we set up these bilateral partnerships where we typically did it in a results-based way to pilot and to learn from, and because we thought results-based payments were the best way of targeting the incentive where it's needed to support the governance decisions and policies needed to protect forests, be it from land use planning, law enforcement, protected areas, indigenous territories, and align sector policies across the board, be it agricultural policies, energy, mining, and so on. So we cannot, from Norway, sit and decide what's the policy changes a country can do, but we can support the overall impact of that, which is not easily measured, but is measurable in the form of reduce deforestation. Later, we developed a broader set of strategies, partially as a response. I think it's right to say that initially we were more narrowly focused on REDD+ as a mechanism in the Climate Convention, in our bilateral work, and in our support to civil society. Partially as a response to this demand not coming about through the Climate Convention in Copenhagen from binding targets, as Arild mentioned in the beginning, or from legislation in the US or the EU. The US was actually quite close, and Obama pushed healthcare first, and after that there was no climate legislation. The EU also did not include REDD+ in its emissions trading scheme, I think partially due to the challenges of oversupply and balancing and maintaining a price signal for carbon in the EU. So we were left with many years of ODA for continuing to pilot REDD+ or pilot or to implement, to work together to reduce deforestation, and results-based payments being one mechanism for doing that. We still believed in it, despite we didn't always do it to mobilize the market. We did it because we thought it was a good way of spending our taxpayers' money in a targeted way to support governments and support the leadership of countries that reduce deforestation. We then later broadened our strategy, as I said, to other areas, including collaboration on international forest crime, critically collaboration on reduced deforestation from global supply chains, particularly from agriculture, from soy, meat, and palm oil, which remains a big part of our work today. Our work with financial markets to measure deforestation and account for deforestation in investment portfolio, and to support all of these initiatives. Well, I should say, partially a topic of today is our work to protect indigenous peoples more broadly, not just in REDD+ and carbon markets, but it's a very broad portfolio of supporting the rights of indigenous peoples, the livelihoods of indigenous peoples, locally and globally in different aspects. And to support all these strategies, our work to improve satellite imagery and data around deforestation, not only as a transaction cost for a carbon transaction, but more importantly to improve land use decisions and policy making, and to allow for indigenous peoples to point to deforestation alerts, to allow for companies to track deforestation in their supply chains, to allow governments and others to go after international forest crimes. But REDD+ remains a very important part of our strategy, because we do not think it's fair to say to tropical forest countries that they're alone in this endeavor. We recognize that part of the drivers of deforestation are international, and these are countries with they're all different, but they don't have always the capacities or the financial resources to implement the strategies that not only is in their national interest to improve land use, because it's not something they only do for us, but it is a global service too, and so we should be part of a partnership with developing countries to provide incentives to support that transition. And I think we've done the more we talk about REDD+ and the need for incentives, the more often people kind of neglect that self-interest, and I think that's very important. You see that I just came from Brazil. You see the impact of deforestation on soil yields, on hydropower reservoirs, and so there's a very clear economic national self-interest in protecting forests. I think Brazil certainly recognizes that, but still I think we do need to find ways of mobilizing incentives and resources to tropical forest countries. We had a breakthrough in Glasgow with more ODA several years ago, but that is not enough. We're also having interesting discussions now around the alternative ways of mobilizing private capital through the Tropical Forest Finance Facility. That is going to be challenging. We're very much engaged in that discussion too. And I think carbon and other ways of monetizing economic or ecosystem services have a role to play. So that's one framing point I would like to make. The other, when it comes to REDD+, REDD+ is many different things, as Arild kind of alluded to in the beginning, and has been over time. I think one is the sort of the climate negotiations. One country reduces and a trading mechanism, if you will, Article 6 and all those. Another is the ODA, that it was the jurisdictional RED. And in parallel to our work with tropical forest countries, typically Norway, UK, Germany, a broader group through the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, this was seen as the government's work to work together to reduce emissions with RED+, and the private sector focused on the standalone carbon projects. Some of them good for the local community, some of them robust in an environmental way, but as a totality, that market would never scale up to reduce deforestation at the pace we required. And as a totality, that market contained a number of human rights abuses. We saw that in many of our tropical forest partner countries, frustrations of indigenous peoples, that there were carbon cowboys, as they're referred to, coming in, convincing them to sign agreements that they don't know about, or inflated baselines that eat up the total volume of carbon to the extent that the government cannot engage as a government in carbon partnerships as well. So we joined that criticism. We had criticized that for a number of years. There was the articles in The Guardian that Arin mentioned, and we came out and also supported that criticism quite broadly, saying that there is another way. RED can be done in a way that supports the targets, the incentives, and the policy changes needed, and distributes benefits and includes stakeholders in the conversation around what's needed to be done in a fair way. And that's the jurisdictional RED frame. I think going back to the early days, I think the debate in the beginning, I've seen a big change since the Copenhagen days, if you will. Where there was, or even before, when I was working at the World Bank, when they set up the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, and there were indigenous protests and said, don't do this, don't monetize our land, don't monetize carbon. Very important concerns. But there's a very different discussion now around RED+. I think there's a broader support for jurisdictional RED from indigenous peoples. I think we've come a long way. There's absolutely challenges in every country in the world, including our own, to consult and include indigenous peoples. But I think the indigenous movement we have seen has supported efforts to work with tropical forest countries at the government level, at the country level, and to set up mechanisms to support in that process their livelihoods and their rights. The debate is not whether or not to do jurisdictional RED, whether it can be good. Certainly it can be discussions around who buys, or it could be discussions of how it's implemented. But it's not a criticism of jurisdictional RED as a concept as much as we saw in the beginning. If anything, there was the concern around the RED understood as the carbon cowboys coming in with independent standalone projects not connected to a broader national framework. I think the debate we've heard, some of the interventions now is about how it is implemented. So it's not necessarily about whether jurisdiction RED can be a good thing, or whether arts standard, trees, as you mentioned, is a robust standard. I think most would argue that it goes further than anything we've done before, even further than the agreement in the climate negotiations among countries. So then it's, of course, when it comes to implementation, there will be challenges. And to the quote, we're doing RED because it's important, not because it's easy. I would say we're doing jurisdiction RED because it's important, not because it's easy. It is comparatively easier to have a carbon project. And that's part of the reason companies did that and bought from that. They could maintain the risk, isolate the risk. They could send in the best consultant on human rights and have a consultation with one community. It is much harder to do RED across a state or a country. Some of the Brazilian states, Pará is doing consultations of 50 locations in a state 3 or 4 times Germany in area, with very little infrastructure. That is very complex, and each of those communities have a different history, different culture, and so on. So doing that right is very, very complex. I think we heard many examples here of how there are disagreements around how it's done. and important discussions around how it could be done better. So I think that's important as a reflection of where are we in this debate. I think the fact that there is a process to at the global level with the standard to provide these inputs to the Art Secretariat periodically is very important. I think I encourage all the speakers or all the people in the room to make use of that process and to provide comments. So that's one. And I also want to, of course, in the country, the best way to, or the best recipient of that message of how it's implemented is the actors involved in that country. And I think it's important. I regret the fact that we don't have some of the governments in the room that were mentioned in these processes today. I think Guyana or Costa Rica would have their views of the governments of the process that has aspired and how they will go about to take on that feedback. But you can't do everything in 3 hours, but I think that's an important conversation that needs to happen as well. Similarly, some of the concerns raised, I think the Art Secretariat probably should opine on also. So when it comes to our role, we have funded the establishment and the operations of the Architecture for Red Transactions, ART, exactly because we wanted to support increased demand for jurisdictional red done right, and to try to sort of capture the energy that was in the market we did not support, to channel that in a way that supports the governments and to support processes that are inclusive of indigenous peoples, local communities, and respects their rights and allow them to benefit from the structures. I spoke a bit of script, so I'll just take a second here to see if there's anything I forgot to mention. So of the jurisdictional standards, I think there might now be, I think Vera also evolved into this this landscape that art has sort of trailblazed, if you will, partially as a response to the criticism of the standalone projects. And I don't know if there will be more standards supporting the jurisdictional process, but I do recognize that art is seen widely as a robust standard. We certainly think it is. I'm sure there are ways it can be improved. It's not Norway's standard. That I have to say, it's very important to emphasize. Yes, we were part of the initial discussions of setting up a standard. We supported the establishment of a process to get feedback and expert advice on how to establish a standard. We did not write the standard, and we don't determine how art implements its decisions. There's an independent board, there's a secretariat. We have a dialogue with the secretariat as a funder. And some of these issues have been part of that dialogue, but it's not that we decide on behalf of art. And I think I'm not saying that to be defensive. I'm saying that because it's important that it is an independent standard. It's not just Norway's views that determines what's right and how it should be done. It has the standard has also, in its development operations and refinements, set up processes to include indigenous peoples and local communities. We're very much supportive of that. And I hope if there have been cases where communities or actors have not been heard, that there could be a way through these channels to make sure that your concerns are heard. So I'm being asked to stop here. So I'll do that. I think there'll be the room for coming back with other points as well. But thank you for having me here. Yeah.
And I said we have maybe one or two quick questions. We also have a panel at the end, but one or two quick questions. We have space for that. Yep. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Wen-Tin Chen, a senior researcher from Norwegian Institute for Water Research.
Yeah.
I thank you so much for a very good description of the program and how it was and its history. And you mentioned that and at the project level there are a lot of private companies involved in investing in that, and you also mentioned that those projects are most likely small scale and difficult to scale up. From your experience, what are the main challenges for these companies to scale up their projects?
I think I'm not saying they're all small scale. Some of these project areas are huge and they are complex too. But if we're looking at what the science tells us is needed, in terms of reductions in deforestation, if we're talking about what countries aim to achieve, and if you're thinking about how to incentivize change, I think that is part of our difference also with the project group, that it's not all bottom up. And this is interesting when it comes to jurisdiction red, that there's a bit of tension between what's easiest from a social perspective and what's needed from an environment perspective. So if you have a bottom-up process, community by community, which might take decades, but it is easier to get that right, if you will, from a social perspective. From an environment perspective, having 4,000 RED projects in a country with different methodologies will not support the government or the policy changes needed to reduce deforestation. In fact, part of the baseline is often the government doesn't care. So rather than taking the government and the political will as an externality, we believe in jurisdictional RED supporting a wanted transition that the government wants to implement, not alone, but with participation from communities. So that is the many reasons why jurisdictional RED is preferred. From a social perspective, I think it's very hard to do these consultations, right, with the right resources, the languages and frameworks, and that will be different from place to place also. It's not like art can set one set of rules that will be effective and support the rights in every setting. But it avoids the carbon cowboys social risk of having the market actors with very limited care or knowledge of how this is done go in and offer some beers and sign a contract. That is certainly not what we agreed in the Climate Convention, neither from a social perspective nor from an environmental perspective.
Good. So, thank you, Andreas. We'll move on and catch up. You know, we are planned to finish at 15:45, which is the official government ending of the working day.
I believe it's still summertime. It's 3 p.m.
Okay. Christina Voigt is the next. She's a professor of law at the university down the road here, and is also a member currently of the Art Board. Been a RED negotiator and working including on indigenous rights. Maybe I should say, since she's a lawyer and I shouldn't say something incorrectly, I have to just make clear that she joined the board after the Guyana decision that we have discussed, the decision in 22. So you can speak open and freely about that. So very much welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Arild, both for a very kind introduction, but also for the invitation to be here today. I say a couple of words about why I think this is particularly pertinent, but also thank you, Anne, and Development Today, and Frit Uhr for organizing this super critical exchange. Is that what you called it in your first slide? Or critical exchange? We're not here to shut down, to kill RED+. That was your opening statement, Arild. But we're here to make it better. And we can only make it better together. With the experiences we are gaining together, over the many years that we now have RED Plus with us. Now, a couple of caveats. Thank you, Arnold. As you mentioned, I'm a current member of the board, the art board, but I was elected a member past the situation that was discussed earlier today. I'm also not here to speak on behalf of the board because we are 8 individuals working in our personal capacity. I cannot speak for all of them. And but I will share, of course, some of my experiences with the board. I'd also like to reiterate something that Andrea said. I've been enjoying this conversation very much, the inputs that were given, but I do believe we would have benefited from having the respective countries in joining the conversation, Guyana and Costa Rica. I think that would have been an added value to the exchange that we have today, as well as the Art Secretariat. And please indulge with me for a second. I would really like to thank the Art Secretariat, in particular Christy Magercourt and Mary Grady, who spent an enormous amount of time and energy in making this work, and also listening to the inputs and stakeholder feedbacks now for quite some time. Thank you also, both the previous speakers that we heard today and some of the organizations that are represented here, for your input and feedback on the revision of trees towards the adoption of 3.0. It is eventually the board who will adopt it, so it is very relevant to hear this, although all the input is collected by the Secretariat and then compiled, and this is what then gets to the 8 board members for consideration and eventually adopt. Okay, so these were lots of caveats and introductory remarks. Where should I start? Maybe very briefly at the beginning, and Andreas also was alluding a little bit to the beginning, but I think we cannot understand where we are today and how far we've come, how many challenges we've encountered and mastered if we don't understand where we came from initially. I think it is fair to say that Indigenous peoples' rights and local communities, which we haven't really talked about that much, lie at the very heart of RED Plus. Because it was from the very beginning, and we were part of the very early conversations all the way now, and Andreas and NICFI colleagues here in the room, and Lars Løvold from the Rainforest Foundation. It was a recognition that the forests that we do still have, the tropical forests that are standing, that are preserved, conserved, are to a significant extent managed by Indigenous peoples, either on their land or under their use, and have been protected because of Indigenous peoples acting as stewards of the forests. So the protection of Indigenous peoples' rights in the context of the framework of RED, and being a lawyer, I talk a lot about the rules around what we have, is an absolutely central component and has been from the very beginning of the RED Plus framework, both under the convention, now also part of the Paris Agreement, and of course Art Plus and many bilateral arrangements. In fact, maybe you know that, but art has 6 what is called immutable principles that cannot be deviated from. And one of the principles is the consistency of everything that art does with the RED Plus framework, and in particular, the safeguards. And Indigenous peoples' rights, as you perhaps know, are part of the safeguards. The safeguards capture broader than just Indigenous peoples' rights. They have environmental component as well as social components, including Indigenous peoples' rights and respect for their rights and knowledge. the RED Plus safeguards were negotiated up to and in Copenhagen and were agreed in Copenhagen but not adopted due to the chaos that erupted. But I went last night through my memorabilia from Copenhagen and I found this scarf. Not that it's so very cold here today, but I thought it was a very interesting thing to have, because in Copenhagen it says also no right, no red. We had a significant mobilization of indigenous peoples, representatives and stakeholders that pointed to the absolute need to have indigenous peoples' rights recognized in the framework for RED+. And that aligned very well with Norway's priorities, in addition to the environmental safeguards on the robustness of baselines and so forth, with having a robust set of safeguards. Now, when the first RED decision, including the safeguards, was adopted 1 year later in Cancun, it was celebrated as a significant achievement, a breakthrough. To have safeguards there was something previously unheard of in the climate context. It just did not exist before under the UN climate treaties. So it was the first time that in a climate context, indigenous people's rights were explicitly mentioned. That was the starting point. And this is important to remember when we think about where we are today. The second importance of these safeguards were that they also gave a very important signal to forest countries, to host countries, about the need for policy reforms, legal changes, institutional changes, in order to make sure that they were able to protect and respect the rights of indigenous peoples. And it's always a very delicate balance negotiating these agreements. Many of you perhaps know that, because on the one hand, you have the sovereign interest of the host states who doesn't want to be told what to do domestically. On the other hand, you have, of course, the interest of donors in a legitimate and credible setup, where we also have to report back to taxpayers about where the money goes, and it has to be made sure that it's not do any harm, or even do better than not doing any harm. So that balance was carefully negotiated and included in the RED+ safeguards. And I do think it's fair to say, and I think we've heard it also from Julia and earlier speakers, that the RED+ framework, as it was adopted and then implemented, has led to a significant strengthening of the rights of indigenous peoples that perhaps otherwise would not have happened. In particular, in the context of identification of who the indigenous communities are, in terms of participation and consultation, but also in terms of recognizing their material rights, land rights, tenure rights, usage rights, and so forth. And in some cases, also to the recognition of carbon rights. But that is a domestic issue. Like how countries, domestically, national jurisdictions regulate the recognition of carbon rights, and that differs from country to country. And finally, it has also led to benefit sharing agreements between the government and indigenous communities, where the revenues from RED+ activities trickle down all the way to the people, the indigenous peoples on the ground. So these are positive outcomes that we've seen, and they should not be forgotten in our critical exchange today. And the establishment of the Safeguard Information System. You may think, well, yeah, it's a safeguard information system, but it focused the international attention to what is happening domestically, to how countries implement their human rights, their indigenous peoples' obligations, because that information is publicly available to everyone on the Lima Information Hub, and increase the transparency and openness about what is happening domestically, information that maybe otherwise would not have been so easily accessible. Now, as I said, many of what I just said would perhaps not have happened without RED and without the safeguards in RED. But not everything is perfect. I'm not saying that. We've been coming a long way, And we've learned a lot through learning by doing. I remember the very early days of NICFI. Learning by doing, trying to gather best practices, thinking ahead of what is necessary, but also to revisions over time of the frameworks that we have and trying to improve and improve and improve to make it better. And in this context, consultations and exchanges like this were and are absolutely crucial. Now, the RED Plus framework was considered to be so important, in particular the safeguard, that they have been included now in the Paris Agreement in Article 5, Paragraph 2, as you perhaps know, but also in the Sustainable Development Tool recently adopted by the supervisory body of the Article 6 crediting mechanism under the Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, which thought that the experience with RED Plus safeguards was so important, so crucial, that they kind of upscaled them to the general interaction and transactions of credits under Article 6.4. Now, so much to RED Plus. Now, briefly to art. Art, as I already said, has to be consistent with the RED Plus framework adopted under the convention, especially Cancun Safeguard, as an immutable principle, as I mentioned already in the beginning. And that is based on the fact that this safeguard setup framework was adopted by 196 states after very lengthy negotiations. And this is why we now have the standards, TRIS 1.0, which was then replaced by TRIS 2.0, and now we're working on a revision of TRIS 2.0 towards TRIS 3.0, where the safeguards are squarely reflected. If you ever had a look at the TRIS, at the standard, you will see them there, all the safeguards A to G, as they are written in the RED Plus decisions that adopted them. And the standard is what matters. I think Julia mentioned that very clearly in her intervention, because it is the standard against which the VVB, the Validation and Verification Body, will check the list, as Anne mentioned, of whether the forest country has done everything correctly, and then make a decision on verification and eventually certification as it then goes to the board. So it's very important that parties have to show how they address and respect all these safeguards that are included in the standard. Because it is in order to ensure that jurisdictional RED Plus activities, as Andreas just highlighted, do not just not do harm, but do better and lead even to co-benefits. And I will use my last 2 minutes in the end towards speaking a little bit about non-carbon co-benefits. But in the standards, and that's very important, each safeguard from those Cancun safeguards is broken down to further indicators, 3 indicators. And that goes much beyond what was agreed under the Framework Convention or is in the Paris Agreement. It's much more specific. They're indicators for structure, for progress, process, and outcome. And that goes above and beyond in terms of specificity of what parties managed to agree many years back under the Framework Convention. I think that's very important because it shows the development of where we've come, how far we've come, and how much has happened in the meantime. There's also a stepwise approach, which is inherent in RED Plus in general, that we learn over time, that applies also to the implementation of safeguards. Now, as we already heard, there's also a grievance mechanism in terms of a complaint possibility and an appeals possibility. Again, that's also something that goes above and beyond what was multilaterally agreed under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But as I said, it's not perfect. It is never perfect. We constantly learn, but RED has always been based on the notion of improvement over time, based on the feedbacks, based on what we've learned and how it can be made better. But I think in general, it's absolutely correct. As Andreas mentioned, there is much support. We're not talking about shutting down RED, as Arald said, but to be extra critical in making it better. And here, of course, the revision of the trees standard comes in very squarely. It's now out for comments on the art website. If you just Google art trees, you get there straight away, and you can send a message to the art secretariat with any comments you have. As I said, they compile them and bring them to the attention of the board. There already have been extensive consultations, there have been country visits, there have been meetings, there has been the establishment of an Indigenous Peoples Local Communities Advisory Group involved in the revision of the standard with the specific focus on improving Indigenous peoples' rights, both these consultative rights and the recognition of their material rights, some of the issues that Julia mentioned in her intervention. So that feedback is important. The feedback that you gave today, the feedback that you still will give, hopefully, to the revision of the standard, because the standard is the backbone of what art does. Now, as I said, finally, in addition to the standard against which validation and verification happens, art and the art board also worked on something called Beyond Carbon Benefits, or CBD, which is BCB, which is an additional layer of certification. It's not something against which payments will be made, because payments will still be made on the reduced emissions and increased removals. But it's a certification layer that can guide priorities of buyers, of which credits they would like to buy. This is also in order to avoid a race to the bottom, and rather create a race to the top by adding that additional layer to the existing standard. Again, in the development of the Beyond Carbon Benefit layer, we worked with Indigenous peoples organizations, and it was again open for public consultation, but that closed on the 11th of August, very recently. So again, thank you all very much, both for inviting me here, for sharing your concerns, but also most importantly for sharing your constructive inputs on how the standard can be improved. What are the concerns? I noted down quite a lot in terms of increasing transparency, consultation language, reducing technicality, and so forth. This will all be discussed, but this feedback is important, and it's really the only way to make things work better for all of us, and most importantly as well for the climate. Thank you so much.
Great, and thanks a lot. We have space for one quick questions, or a question that requires a quick answer, rather.
I'm Lars Løvold from Rainforest Foundation Norway. Question to both Andreas and Christina, in the sense that I think a common theme of the three interventions from Costa Rica, Guyana, and the process that Julia from RFN has conducted was in the sense that they had developed and engaged very deeply. They had very concrete proposals. They wanted to discuss those proposals, and they could not. Is there any explanation for that, or is that a wrong impression?
You mean in the revision of the standard, the RED 3.0? I don't have any detailed overview of how the Secretariat schedules the consultations and inputs, but it has asked for written input. I think that's perhaps the only manageable way for the rather small Secretariat, given that there are thousands of stakeholders. It can be individuals, can be organizations that provide input, and I think it's maybe a matter of efficiency in order to process everything. But as I said, I cannot speak for how the Secretariat conducts the consultations, but I guess the amount of input is something that we need to consider, and the timeline necessary to make a proposal for the board for its adoption.
Good. I think we have to close it there and say great thank you, and take that that kind of encouragement to comment. Don't Google just art trees, because then you get paintings of trees, but add forest or carbon to your Google search. Last speaker is Darragh Conway. I'm not good at pronouncing Irish names, but Darragh. He's a senior program officer at the 10-year facility, which is based in Stockholm. Coordinates the work on indigenous peoples and local communities relating to carbon markets and RADD. So, 10-year facilities, you may say more, but it's a facility established in 2014. It was the first international financial mechanism exclusively focused on land and forest rights of indigenous people, Afro-descendant peoples and local communities, and currently funding activities and work in more than 20 countries. So, Darragh, please.
Good afternoon. We're still awake? Yeah? Sorry, I know it's the end of a long session. So I will try and keep it interesting. It's hard sometimes to go at the end because a lot of the things I wanted to say have kind of been said. So I'll try and say them in an interesting way. As Harold mentioned, 10-year facility works directly with indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities in more than 20 countries now, providing primarily finance, but also technical support. And we've had so many requests from them to understand better what are these carbon markets, what is REDD+, that we've started to provide more structured support on that. So, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. But I want to start with two fundamental truths. And we've heard these before, but let's just to recap. The first fundamental truth is that in most tropical forest countries, and certainly most countries that have submitted concept notes to art, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities own a large amount of the forest. So in the Brazilian Amazon, that's about 1/3. In the Colombian Amazon, it's almost half. In much of the Congo Basin, it's about 85%. And in Papua New Guinea, it's 97%. The second fundamental truth is that the forests that are managed and owned by these indigenous peoples and local communities is in much better condition than other forests. That's including forests that's managed by government under protected areas. It's under much better condition and it has much lower deforestation. So we're talking about actors who own, in many cases, most of the forest, who are the best managers of the forest, and yet all too often we hear them spoken of as stakeholders, beneficiaries, kind of semi-important actors that we kind of need to talk to, and we kind of need to have on board somehow, but not really as central actors in the process. So recognizing that, of course, governments are always going to be central actors in jurisdictional processes, I would argue that indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant peoples and local communities should be equally, in many cases, important actors. And that requires a bit of a mindset shift. It's a shift from stakeholders to partners. It's a shift from beneficiaries to implementers. So how do we make this mindset shift happen and then translate it into what actually matters? And I would say that needs to happen on 3 levels. And that's on the level of rule books, on the levels of playbooks, and on the level of checkbooks. So I'm going to speak a little bit about each of these. And I'm going to start with rule books, because maybe as a lawyer as well, I'm a bit biased and I think rule books are important. But it's a lot of what we've been talking about today. And the main rule book we're talking about today is the Art Tree Standard. So what does the Art Tree Standard need to do to ensure this mindset? I would say it's 2 main things. And the first is to ensure that indigenous people's rights and local communities' rights are respected in the rules. And that's looking at things like free, prior, and informed consent, which is not currently required in most cases. That's looking at the ownership of emission reductions, recognizing that Indigenous people own emission reductions in the forest that they own. That's things like ensuring that benefits are fairly distributed according to ownership of emission reductions, but also according to the role in achieving emission reductions. And Julia's spoken a lot about how these rules could be improved, and so I don't want to get into too much detail about that. But the second thing is ensuring the rules are implemented. And we've heard a lot from Christina about how the rules are based on the Warsaw Safeguards, and the Warsaw Red Forest Framework and the Warsaw Safeguards provides a really important starting point, because as mentioned, these were negotiated over many, many years by 190 plus governments. But then the question, they're very broad. Anyone who's familiar with the safeguards know they're quite broad, and so there's a lot of detail to be figured out. And part of that detail is in how the safeguards are translated into more detailed guidance. And ART has done something, I would agree with you. ART has definitely done a decent amount to make them a bit more detailed, but they're still quite broad. But then the second question is, how are they implemented? And how do we ensure that they're implemented? So the governments are the ones responsible for implementing, but it's these validation and verification bodies that are responsible for checking that they've been implemented. And then ultimately the Art Secretariat to check the recommendations of these VVBs. And what we've heard today from various of the speakers, and it's really true, is that the VVBs, they do not have the expertise to be able to do this. We heard from Levy speaking about VVBs going to Costa Rica and not even speaking Spanish. How can you go and really have conversations with Indigenous people if you don't even speak the national language, let alone Indigenous languages? Right? There's a lot of focus. If you look at the requirements that ART has for VVBs in the ART standard, they require a lot of expertise on technical topics like emissions calculations, and that's really important. But there's absolutely no requirement to have any expertise on Indigenous people's rights. So how is it possible to assess compliance with safeguards on Indigenous people's rights if you don't have any expertise on the topic, even in general, let alone in the country? We have we talked a bit about, someone mentioned Vera earlier. That's more on the project-based, although they also have a jurisdictional. They're moving a bit in that direction with their proposals for their new standard. And I think that'd be really interesting for ART to look at how they could do the same. So, okay. So much for rule books. Well, no, not so much for rule books. Let's just quickly say, I would agree with Julia that the 3.0, the draft of 3.0 has gone some way to addressing these concerns, but a lot of them haven't yet been addressed. And so as there's a public consultation period coming up, well, it's currently underway. The deadline's coming up next month. This is a really important opportunity for those who are interested in this topic to make those comments, because there is still a really, really important opportunity now to improve that rule book. But okay, let's move on from rule books and onto playbooks. So the ones who are responsible for implementing the ART trees rules are ultimately governments. They're the ones who design the programs, they're the ones who implement the programs. And I think here what the mindset shift that we need to see from governments is, again, not looking at Indigenous people as stakeholders that we have to consult, not looking at these rules on things like free, prior and informed consent as an obligation, but to looking at it as an opportunity. If you want to implement a program that actually reduces emissions from forests, that means stopping deforestation, that means ensuring sustainable forest management, that means doing very difficult things in very remote places. The best way to do those things is by working in partnership with the communities who live in those places, who have for thousands of years been very, very successfully protecting those forests. And I think not enough governments are seeing this amazing opportunity that they have to really, really implement programs, design and implement programs that are going to be very successful. And in many cases, doing it more cheaply, because you don't have to spend a lot of money on having park rangers in very remote places. You're working with Indigenous people who are already there. And I think sometimes governments are just looking at this like these are kind of things that have been imposed on them from outside. But if you really look at how do we make this successful, I think this is the opportunity. And you are seeing some governments start to move in that direction. And some of you might be familiar with what's happening in Peru. The government of Peru is collaborating with the three main indigenous organizations there to develop what would be the first indigenous-led jurisdictional RED+ program. And this is a really encouraging sign. And I think it'd be really interesting to see if more governments decide to follow suit. Now, the third thing where we need the mindset shift is in checkbooks. Who's writing the checks? This is very antiquated language for any younger people in the room. Checkbooks were things that people used to write that meant they were going to pay money later. So checkbooks, we're talking about buyers, of course, the buyers of the carbon credits. These are the ones who are ultimately putting up the bill. Right? At the moment, a lot of the development of these programs is funded by international cooperation, folks like Norway, but ultimately it's the buyers who are putting the money into the market. And I think what the mindset shift that we need from buyers is to realize that the only credit worth buying is a high quality credit. And a high quality credit is not just a credit that is backed by a real emission reduction, it's a credit that has been developed in a way that's fair, in a way that respects both national and international laws, and a credit that has been developed in partnership with those who guard the forest and who rely on the forest. And that means, in many cases, putting your money where your mouth is, because higher quality credits are going to cost more. We've heard about doing FPIC properly, doing free, prior, and informed consent properly takes time. That's true. It takes money as well. That's also true. And the money needs to come up front. And the problem is a lot of the buyers are not willing to put that money up front. They only want to buy the credits once they're absolutely ready. But we do see some encouraging signs. Again, going back to the Peruvian case, where Mercuria, this international commodity trader, is in discussions there about providing upfront finance for that program. And we need to see more of that, because indigenous peoples and governments have limited finance to be able to implement these things well, and development finance and philanthropic finance can only go so far. So, we've talked about rulebooks, we've talked about playbooks, we've talked about checkbooks. Very briefly, I want to talk about the role that the tenure facility plays. As mentioned, our work on this is relatively new, and it's really responding to demands that we're receiving from our partners. And at the moment, we're in the process of discussing with them in more detail to see what they need. What we're hearing from them is, on one hand, they need more information. And so we're working with other organizations like RFN and RFUS to see how do we provide better and more consistent information so they can make informed decisions. They need decision-making support. They need actual analyses to see how all of this, we have carbon projects, we have jurisdictional RED. How is this going to affect our rights? Is this an opportunity for us? Is this a risk for us? How do we manage those risks? And so that's something we're looking at supporting them with. Another thing is, if we are going to get finance through this, how are we going to make sure that this is properly managed? And there's a really interesting development here in that a lot of indigenous people and Afro-descendant people and local communities have been developing their own funds over the last decade or so. And these are ways for them to have financial autonomy, and these are a great way to channel resources. So that's also something we're working with them on. And finally, one way we help, often in the countries we work, we have very close relationships with the indigenous peoples' movements. We also have close relationships with the governments. And so often governments will come to us and seek some advice. And so we help to build bridges and provide a bit that perspective to governments of how can you ensure that you implement a program in a good way. I think in many cases, governments do want to do the right thing, and they're not really quite sure how to do it. And they're worried about the time and they're worried about the cost. And so that's something that we engage with governments on, figuring out how can we ensure that indigenous people's rights are properly respected in these programs. So to conclude, I think we need a mindset shift. This is not just about tinkering with a few rules here and there. This is really a fundamental shift away from looking at indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities as stakeholders, as beneficiaries, to implementers, to partners. And that's not necessarily going to be easy, but it is important. And I've heard that, I really liked that quote earlier, and I think we can apply that to this particular issue. We don't work with indigenous peoples because it's easy, but we work with them because it's important. One other quote that I've heard, I know there were some concerns about timing. There was concerns about this is going to take a long time. And I get that. I get that there's a lot of urgency, and we've been discussing REDD+ now since, 2005? It's 20 years. And there's not enough, and it's not going fast enough. So I really do get this sense that we need to move faster. But there's a great saying in a lot of Spanish-speaking countries, we have to go slowly because we're in a hurry. And if we try and rush too much with these things, we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot. If you try and implement programs without partnering with those who are actually living in the forest, the ones who can really make a change on the ground, it's not going to work. And we've seen that from the experience of governments with protected areas, which are often ineffective because it's too expensive to run and because they don't have the support on the ground. So I would say, really, when we're looking at the changing the R3 standard, when we're looking at how we implement it as governments, when we're looking as buyers at what credits we buy, think about that. Let's go slowly because we're in a hurry. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We are running a bit over time, but we can continue until 4, and if you have to go, you're free to leave. But let's get the 3 panelists that are here, the 3 last speakers, to sit here, and we'll have a small debate, and with some questions, maybe also we have time for 1 or 2 from the audience. But please have a seat in the front here. And I'm just going to clarify what John F. Kennedy said. We are going to the moon because it's easy. Not because it is, but because it's hard. He didn't say it was important, and it was not to go to the moon. But thanks a lot, Darren, for a few nice quotes. And also, I think this rule book, playbook, checkbook, I think it's a universal theory that we can apply. I'm going to use it for my students in a number of areas, that division. So, please, Anne.
Am I on? Yes. Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much to the 3 speakers. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your thoughtful presentations. Really a lot of food for thought, as they say. I think we would really love to get your reaction to some of the presentations that were given earlier. I wanted first to just take the opportunity, since I have the mic, to respond to this feeling that, the governments should have been here, Art Secretariat should have been here. And in a larger format, it would have been really interesting to do that. We were doing this on a shoestring budget, and all of the generous contribution of Fritur and others went straight to Litteraturhuset, so this is what we were able to manage. Maybe the next time we can expand this discussion. I think that would be a great idea. I wonder do we have Julia and Mario Stian standing by? I wondered whether we could start with a question for Mario and put Hege's question directly to Mario, since it was really focusing on the Guyana experience. And if I understand, Hege was, can we bring Mario Hastings up? So we're just waiting for him to join. Yes, but you did mention that in the case of Guyana, they had 8 months, right? So I just wanted to, since we have him here online, hopefully, can you hear us, Mr. Hastings?
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good. We don't have your picture, but at least we have your sound, so that's very good. So the question was climate crisis, urgency, we don't have time to wait. In the case of Guyana, it was mentioned that there was an 8-month consultation process. It sounds like a long time. Can you respond from your experience to that intervention?
Well, okay, well, we know that time factor was very important, but I would like to say that since it was something new, we still think we have to take time because of the newness of this project or the scheme. So we just don't want to rush into things that we have never had any kind of experience to be on the safe side. So we feel as indigenous people that time is very, very important. And unless we are part of these plans or programs at the inception, I think we would go a great way, but excluding us, that is where we would face a lot of problems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And the next question, really, I wanted to repeat Lars Lövold's question because I got a little text from Julia saying that she wanted to respond. And just to remind us, Lars was saying that, you know, from what Levi Sucre was saying, from what Mario Hastings was saying, and from what Julia was telling us about this letter, Indigenous organizations have really tried to engage with art, like not just a phone call or a meeting, but several meetings over years, and have not received the kind of reception that you would hope. Do we have Julia? Yeah, Julia is online. I just wanted to say one thing. Dara mentioned that Peru is a unique case in that they are, for the first time, testing out an indigenous co-government-led application to art. I would mention that one of the organizations that's part of that application is IDACEP, which signed the letter calling for reform of the standards. So they're engaging, but at the same time, they have concerns. So I just wondered, Julia, you said you wanted to speak to Lars's question. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly share the interaction with the Art Secretariat. So the response was that just for fairness considerations and giving the same voice to all stakeholders, they were not interested at this stage to give us one-to-one meeting with our partners the way we were able to have them with GLUA and NICPI, for example. Which can be understood to some extent, but I think the level of effort and the coordination we had and the number of organizations we were, it would have been worthwhile for both sides. And then the second one that you mentioned, Anne, was that there were some consultation. I mean, this question of fairness was not necessarily implemented by the standard itself, because there were some consultation procedures with some organizations, but not others. And it was not fully transparent on what was shared, what was said, what were the feedback given. So yeah, just to answer that question briefly.
Thank you, Julia. So I feel like we need to focus on Guyana because it's the only test case we have. It's the only country where art credits have been issued. And, you know, initially when the announcement was made by the Art Board, NICPI welcomed the credit issuance. This is back in December 2022, calling it a historic breakthrough for the emergence of a high-quality global carbon market to protect tropical forests. But when Indigenous people said that their rights had been violated, there was no public comment from Norway. So how do we understand that? I mean, art clearly took the government's side in this dispute, right? What is Norway's assessment of what happened? And are you satisfied that the credits that were issued by art are actually high integrity based on the concerns that have been raised?
Well, I think this is an important discussion that I think Guyana should be asked to respond to. I think they could have replied or been part of this free of charge from remote, and I think that would be a better discussion to have. I think it's when we congratulated Guyana on the transaction, I think it's because we recognized that they had gone through as the first country a process that is very demanding. And that was a milestone in itself. And that there was an important news for that there was serious interest in the jurisdictional market, not just in the project market, and that was also a cause for celebration. I cannot know what has transcribed in Guyana. It is hard for us to follow that from here. I think it's not appropriate for me to comment on what the process in Guyana has been. I think that's why we have supported the establishment of a structure that it's not Norway running around certifying carbon credits, and there's a reason for that, and that we don't have the right or the capacity to do so, and so that's why we supported ART to set up a structure. And as I said earlier, of course, ART is one thing at the written rules, the rule book, but then when it comes to a reality in a specific political or historical context, there will be different views, and I don't want to defend one side or the other. I just want to recognize that and to say that we have had faith in the way that this structure is set up to work. Just to when it comes to ART, I think it's unfortunate that people feel that they have not been heard or had the chance to engage. I think there's well, I haven't talked to them for a while, but I do know that they have a very small team working endless hours and are obsessed of doing it the right way and having a due process that everyone feels fairly treated. So I hope there's a way to rectify this and make sure in the process now and the revisions at least that there can be a way to engage. But I think this treating everyone equal is also my impression that might have expired there. Thanks.
Christina, as it was said before, and I think it's really an important thing to remember that you weren't there when the decision was made about the Guyana credits. Do you have any reflections about it? And I would just add that 33 million tons of carbon credits were sold to an oil company. I know ART has no say about who government sells their credits to, but what are your reflections on the question that I asked Andreas? And what is the climate accounting of selling forest carbon credits to an oil company? Is there a climate benefit there?
Okay, these were like 3 questions in one, but maybe it was before my time, but I do know quite a bit of the details of what happened. It was the first issuance of credits. It's a very complex landscape. The government provides information. There have been consultations with indigenous peoples representatives in Guyana, including the NTC that we discussed and others. It's very difficult to eventually to evaluate one statement against another. Right. For that reason, it's very important to have that appeals mechanism. Now, there are challenges with it, and that's one of the issues that are now under revision. I think that's a very, very important aspect, to have an independent appeal possibility in a situation like this, where the truth is perhaps somewhere in the middle, and it's not very concise to know exactly where the challenges lies, where different perceptions are out there. So having that independent appeal body in place as already and revised and strengthened, I think is one of the very important aspects that at least we will take back to the R30 revision. Now, your other element on what the money is being used for, it's correct. Art doesn't have any say on the sovereign decision by the country or sub-national entity on which buyer they choose. It can be COSIA, it can be a company, it can be one of the LEAF partners, government or a corporate actor. That is outside our mandate and is a sovereign decision. Now, the climate benefit, of course, in this case, is an offset using the credits against otherwise happening emissions. But we talked about offsets. That's more of a ideological discussion that we probably don't want to go into here. But that's the benefit is to offset. But there's also a possibility for host countries to freeze the credits or to de-evaluate them, where of course then the climate benefit would be higher, but that's again a sovereign decision of the forest country.
Would you like to speak to that? Is there a climate benefit, net climate benefit to selling tropical forest carbon credits to an oil company? I know oil companies are not eligible for the LEAF coalition. But I mean, so this first jurisdictional RED project went through, but what's the climate outcome of that in your assessment?
It's very hard for me to know. I don't know the climate strategies or climate accounting of the buyer in this case. All else equal, this is reducing emissions from the forests. Whether that gives increases emissions on the other end, I don't know. I don't think this to my knowledge, was a voluntary transaction. So whether that led to a slower energy transition, I don't know. It's an interesting sort of debate in the carbon market, whether or not and to what extent companies should be able to sort of accredit their contributions to the voluntary carbon market for their own accounting. So that's there's the Science-Based Targets Initiative. There are other initiatives trying to sort of give norms to what corporates should do in different sectors. I haven't followed it for some months. I don't know if they have a guidance on the oil and gas sector, but for other sectors they have tried to promote that or provide that guidance of as long as you're on the path towards science-based reductions in emissions. I do think there's this is not about oil and gas, but it's a different related topic in that the norms in the market now is that the companies should not use offsets in much at all. That they are encouraged to provide the removals credits 20 years from now. And to me, that's a question from someone working on tropical deforestation and trying to mobilize engagement from governments, from finance, from the corporate sector as well. Is that the right guidance to send? We're letting the most biodiverse, cultural rich, carbon-rich forests disappear for a decade or two while asking companies to get carbon removal credits from planting trees. I went to a conference in Brazil where it's saying they're getting $50 per ton for tree planting projects. So that goes to the other discussion too about complexity and timing. I don't want to rush things. I don't want to sort of avoid good process. But there is a sense that this is so complex that it's easier to buy land or lease land and plant trees and get away with it corporate from a climate perspective. I don't think that's the right way to mobilize the biggest climate action in the next 10 to 20 years.
Thank you, thank you. So I have a question that maybe, Dara, you could speak to, and then the others are also welcome to comment afterwards. So we have Guyana. Guyana's had 2 rounds of credits issued by ART. In the other 25 jurisdictions where governments are applying to arts for credits, I'm hearing from what Julia is saying, from what you're saying about the feedback you're getting from organizations that you work with that people are worrying about this, or they're trying to understand what is it going to mean for us. Based on what you know now about art to this point, what assurances do Indigenous communities have in those 25 jurisdictions that the experience that Mario Hastings describes in Guyana won't be repeated?
It's a great question, and I think the answer to that, let's say that question will be answered more in a few months' time when Art Trees 3.0 is finalized. There has been a lot of feedback on the revision of the standard. As was mentioned, Art conducted regional consultations with Indigenous peoples and local communities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They conducted consultations with NGOs. They accepted written feedback. As mentioned, the process wasn't always very transparent. They didn't publish the feedback they received. They were asked several times and they refused to share it. But there is now a public comment period, and that feedback will be available online as far as I'm aware. So it will depend quite a bit on the results of that process. I think, at the moment, Indigenous peoples and local communities are concerned in a lot of cases. We've heard, for example, from partners in the Democratic Republic of Congo that, and there's a concept note has been submitted to Art Trees there quite a while ago. And we're hearing from, we're working with a lot of the main Indigenous and local community organizations in these countries. And in the DRC, we're working with 7 different organizations, and they haven't been engaged at all. They haven't really heard much about it. They don't know what's happening. So, and this is very, it's not necessarily surprising, but it is kind of shocking to think that in a country where more than 85% of the forest is owned by Indigenous peoples and by local communities, that the government would have submitted a concept note without consulting at all, without even informing the main Indigenous peoples and local communities organizations. So I think, my guess is that what we've seen with the new draft of 3.0, there are definite improvements in there, yep. But a lot of the issues have not gone addressed. And so I think there's still a bit this sense that, well, we'll leave it up to governments to implement this in the right way. And I think if you do that, some governments will do it better, and some governments won't do it great. And so I think there is a big opportunity to have a stronger standard, to have stronger guidance on how to follow the standard, and to have stronger processes for reviewing whether the standard has been complied with. And that goes back to the qualifications of the validation and verification bodies, and to the grievance mechanism that Christina just mentioned.
I think Aurel has a question, but would either of you like to speak to that, or shall we move to Aurel? Do you want to?
Yeah. Okay, it's on. And just one question, and it was alluded to that, as you know, the history of RED and the way it has been perceived, and including LEAF when it was launched, some countries think that this is, that tabloid term is green imperialism, the whole RED project. Some perceive it as that the global north is going to pay and kind of impose demands and kind of standards on the global south, although it also comes with money. But I wonder if, some of this is the art standard should be more specific. For example, there's no details on benefit sharing. There's no detail, I asked the question to Mario Hastings, about what exactly are the implications for you on the ground. Now, is it a kind of a constraint in the revision of the art standards, beyond that the world is complicated, blah, blah, that there is a limit to how much a standard supported by 3-4 rich countries involving big multinational companies, Secretariat in the US, Emergent based in the US, perceived as the global north, coming here and telling, we don't want just want you to reduce carbon emissions, but here is how you should do it. Is that kind of a problem? Do you have some, or a problem, a kind of a constraint on some of the issues that we can sit here and discuss, this is the way it should be done? It's not simply acceptable, the political reality. Maybe for any of you.
Absolutely. I mean, that is why we cannot sit here and discuss how Brazil should reduce deforestation. That's why they have a strategy. That's why they set up their own policies and their own systems for sharing benefits. So I think there is a limit to how much you can provide detail and standardization across that applies to every situation. There are ways around that, perhaps by setting expectations of a process that is inclusive, or other elements that brings the sort of the local context, can do it in an appropriate way. And of course, there's a tension. I mean, Christina and I were both in the RED negotiations. There was certainly a feeling that we both wanted to respect sovereignty, but we wanted to impose things in the text that we thought were important. And I think that's what this standard does too. There's a clear recognition, I think, from our end that we need to respect sovereignty, and that's the national situation is what is important. And if a country, any country that we work with, feel like we're just imposing our will on them, they will not want to have our partnership. But there's also some sort of universal fundamental ideas that we believe is important if we are to be part of this, and that's why we were fighting hard for 91D or whatever it was that we discussed in Cancun after you sat on the A to G, or I don't know. It was and that was important to us. So there's a balancing act there, how much you can impose from outside and what is appropriate to impose from outside for having a good outcome.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting argument, right? Because you have this idea of green colonialism, this idea that the global north is imposing standards on the global south, and so as I very much understand this idea that Norway as a global north country doesn't want to impose their standards on Guyana or on any other global south country, and that makes total sense. But on the other hand, if we really think about colonialism as it is today, the real victims of colonialism are indigenous peoples, are the local communities on the ground. In many cases, they're continuing to be the victims of colonialism because they don't have their rights recognized by the governments that have sovereignty over those lands. They don't have their own sovereignty recognized. These are nations. These are nations whose sovereignty has not been recognized. So I find it a bit strange to say that, well, we shouldn't recognize indigenous rights because that would be colonial. It's a bit of a weird argument, right? Although
just to be fair, I did not say that.
No, okay. Sorry, but you did. Ariel did, and that was the premise of the question. Sorry, not implying any statement on your behalf. But I do find that a bit strange. But it's a complex one, and it has multiple layers, and so I do think we need to think of practical solutions. And I think one is the process that you mentioned, making sure that certainly Norway or no other global north country should be telling countries how to reduce emissions. But ensuring that there's a fair process, ensuring that indigenous people have a seat at the table, I think should be basic. I think the second thing, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but ensuring that these things are actually implemented. And it goes to the VVBs, as I mentioned, but it's also going to the Art Secretariat. We've talked about how there are a few people and they don't have the capacity to be able to engage with. Julia mentioned they wouldn't engage with these are some of the biggest indigenous organizations in Latin America, all came together for a huge effort to make the submission, and Art couldn't meet them. And there's this argument that Art doesn't have the capacity, and it's true, they don't. But the question is why? If we want to do these things right, maybe Art should have more capacity to be able to do those things. So I think it comes back to the question, if we're going to do this, we should do it right, and we should be investing in that.
Great. We have come to an end. I prepared a 15-minute wrapping up, but I shortened it. So first of all, thanks to everyone online and in the audience. for the record, I didn't say it was a green imperialism, I was just referring. I think we have raised a few issues, and these are important ones. I'm reading a little bit of political science, and a couple of things I picked up in preparation for a course is then one is the terms we use. I think, Darren, you pointed out that beneficiaries. It is as if we have the almighty state generously giving out benefits to its subjects, the people, they're indigenous. No, these are if they protect forests and the government, state level can sell it, the state government are the beneficiaries of what is happening on the ground by indigenous peoples and local communities. So just be aware of the language and what we use it. Maybe they're partners or implementers, as you say. So that's important. The second thing I learned about, politics should be seen as experiments, and these are experiments. The key thing may not be if we get it right from the beginning, but our ability to learn and improve on the system. So Google art, trees, carbon, and provide inputs. It's I guess if you may not have a big say, but if 100 people say the same thing, it may be listened to by Christine and others. And thanks everyone for an important debate and for your participation, both online and here. And have a good day. Thanks to everyone.